Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our second session in our new series called Abolition. Tonight, we are taking a look at the subject of slavery, which is slightly different to all the other subjects, because in the other subjects, we're talking about things that are still existent. There's modern slavery, but we're concentrating mainly on the struggle of the working class against slavery and the role that slavery played in propping up capitalism and in the transition to capitalism. We're very pleased to have two very knowledgeable speakers on the issue. Dan Lazar from the US is an author on constitutional issues, and Andrea Gilbert is a member of Labour Black Socialists and a councillor. So we're starting with Dan first. Both speakers have about 15 to 20 minutes to present their case. Then there's going to be time for questions and comments from the floor. Hello, Dan.
Hi. All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me. Am I unmuted, right? You can hear me, right?
All good, yes.
Yes, okay. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor. In the 15 or 20 minutes allotted to me, I just want to address a few very simple but very important questions. Those are why has slavery proved to be so persistent in the U.S.? Why was the U.S. so slow in why was the U.S. so slow in abolishing slavery? Why has racism proved to be so persistent in the U.S.? And what is to be done? Where does the answer lie? To me, there are basically two answers to these questions. One is kind of a belief that racism arises out of the depths of the white American soul, that the country is indelibly really no solution is possible, because whites are essentially fundamentally recalcitrant. And the other is that the problem arises is political, structural, and economic in nature, and therefore the solution is the same, political, structural, and economic. This issue has arisen with incredible force in American politics recently. Because in 2019, the U.S., the New York Times published an article by a staff writer named Nicole Hannah Jones, marking the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first slave ship in what was then the British colony of Virginia, and arguing that this 1619 was the true founding of America because it marked the start of America as a fundamentally, indelibly racist state. And she went on to argue that the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783 was actually a racist enterprise because it was fought by Americans in defense of slavery against a British Empire that was beginning to move against it. This thesis drew howls of protest from American historians, including many extremely prominent ones, who objected because, number one, there's no evidence that protecting slavery, preserving slavery was on the minds of the American patriots in the 1770s. In fact, anti-slavery sentiment was growing to the point we can say that the America by 1773 or 74 had actually given rise to the first modern anti-slavery movement in the Western world. And they also pointed out that the British Empire was in no sense moving to abolish slavery in its colonial holdings, that is ridiculous. And in fact, slavery would persist for another 60 years. So Hannah Jones took a real beating, and deservedly so. And I must emphasize that I have just empathy with her essentially racial outlook and an essentially pessimistic outlook, because it believes that racism is ineradicable. But let me let me stress that in one respect, she was a bit closer to the mark than her critics were. And that is she highlighted the fundamentally ambiguous nature of the American Revolution. And to explain what I mean by that, let me do a sideline diversion to the French Revolution of 1789 to 94, and of course, most people here know the general outlines of the story. In May 1789, the États Généraux, an assembly of the three great estates, the nobility, clergy, and commoners, were met for the first time in more than 160 years in Paris and Versailles. The commoners asserted themselves and transformed that body into a national assembly. And then in July, 2 months later, things thoroughly exploded when the revolutionary mob assaulted the Bastille in Paris. And the U.S. The American Revolution is often seen as a precursor to the French Revolution, the French Revolution. And it's actually, that is the traditional view among Marxists as well, where the American Revolution is seen as a bourgeois model of bourgeois revolution in a mold that the French Revolution would then expand upon. But let me take issue with this because France 2 years earlier saw a very interesting event. It was called the aristocratic uprising, in which the nobility asserted themselves against royal centralization under Louis XVI, and in so doing, actually garnered a great deal of support, popular support among the commoners. This assertion, this uprising, was the culmination of nearly a century of what's called the aristocratic offensive, in which the nobility tried to claw back their ancient privileges and shut out inroads by the commoners. But this aristocratic uprising in 1787 actually drew great support from the commoners. And in fact, and serious street fighting actually broke out in one French city, in Grenoble, in eastern France. And it seems to me that the American Revolution that broke out in 1775 to 76 was actually much closer to the events of 1787 in France than they were to 1789. The revolution began in Massachusetts, the most democratic and bourgeois, or middle class, I should say, of the British colonies. And the revolutionaries quickly took up arms and quickly expelled the British from Boston. And then they appealed for support to the other colonies, which was quickly forthcoming. But then something interesting occurred. They readily acceded to the leadership of the Virginia aristocracy, the slave owners. Just thus, Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved more than 600 people in the course of his lifetime, wrote the Declaration of Independence, in which he attempted to blame slavery on the British, by the way. George Washington became the commander of the Revolutionary Armies and the first president. James Madison, yet another Virginia slaveholder, became the chief architect of the U.S. Constitution. So the republic that emerged in 1787 to 80, when the Constitution was ratified, was less a bourgeois republic than a pre-bourgeois republic, in which the Southern planters, the Southern aristocracy and nobility, had the upper hand. They did allow the seeds of a bourgeois political order, economic order, to take shape in the northern and central states, but they were still dominated, the central government, which I would argue was essentially pre-bourgeois or even anti-bourgeois. And the events that followed did so inexorably. I mean, slavery spread throughout the entire South. Thanks to the cotton gin and the growth of cotton production. The South adopted ever more ferocious laws against anything hinting of a slave rebellion, and also aimed at corralling and expelling a small free Black population that had taken place in some southern cities. And they also set about trying to rein in growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. And similarly in the North, thanks to the bourgeois seeds that took root as a result of the 1787 Compromise, a very powerful bourgeois upsurge took place. Population grew radically, dramatically, due to mass immigration beginning in the 1830s. Manufacturing expanded dramatically, and agriculture did as well. And by the 1840s, America was emerging as a major wheat producer. So essentially, as those two societies diverged, the seeds of a civil war were planted. And there were a great number of intermediate political steps, confusing political maneuvers that took place in the ensuing 7 decades. But in 1861, things exploded and a civil war broke out. And this was the start of the American bourgeois revolution, not 1776. Marx and Engels exchanged some fascinating letters in 1862. Engels was so fed up with the North's poor prosecution of the war to that point that he said that not only would the North lose, but it deserved to lose, just as sheer and inexcusable incompetence. And Marx replied, no. Yes, the North's prosecution of the war so far has been thoroughly incompetent. But you have to remember the North is a very complex commercial industrial society, that it had been content to leave war to the South, which dominated the US military hierarchy up to that point. But once it learned the arts of war, and once it succeeded in creating a military industrial complex as we now know it, it would prove unstoppable. And Marx was 100% correct. And that's what happened once the South, the leader in the figure of Ulysses S. Grant, who proceeded to completely steamroll over the South. But Marx was less prescient in an article he wrote around the same time for a Viennese newspaper, in which he said that so far the North has prosecuted the war in a constitutional way, but in short course, it would be forced to switch to a revolutionary prosecution. And that unfortunately was not correct. Because once the Northern bourgeoisie, with considerable popular support, but with no organized labor support, once it succeeded in crushing the Southern planter class, and I must emphasize that those events were quite revolutionary. They destroyed the class. They expropriated billions of dollars of private property in the form of human chattel, and they imposed a military dictatorship on the South that, for a time, granted equal rights to Blacks. But once the South was subdued, the North moved rapidly to I'm sorry, is my voice coming through? Am I having transmission problems here, or?
No, it's all good. There's slight delay sometimes, but it's all good.
Okay, all right, great. So, but the North quickly moved, once those goals were accomplished, to reinstate the old constitutional order with a few minimal changes. The Southern planter class was allowed to reassert itself. In some ways, it wound up with even more power than it had previously. Blacks were thrust back into peonage, almost a kind of quasi-slavery, and were subjected to daily terror that, in certain respects, was even worse than what they had known under slavery. Democratic rights were stripped from state constitutions throughout the South. And in 1877, when the North, when the federal government withdrew the last troops from the South, where they had been instituting Reconstruction, they withdrew them in order to redeploy them up north against a rail strike that was an immense rail strike that was immobilizing traffic from coast to coast. So the sum total of the Civil War was to thrust Black people into some kind of peonage or even neo-slavery, to deprive Northern workers of their rights. They couldn't form unions. They couldn't institute the most modest political reforms. They couldn't form a labor party, for example. And the result was a very conservative bourgeois order, which essentially laid the basis for the industrial, financial, commercial colossus that began emerging in the 1880s and 90s and began transforming the global political power structure. And I must add that the situation remained remarkably unchanged for nearly a century after, until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when Blacks were able to successfully mobilize against the most overt and barbaric relics of Southern racist rule. But thanks to that same conservative constitutional structure that was instituted in the wake of the Civil War and which persists, again, remarkably unchanged to the present day, immense racist features still exist in the US. I guess I have a little time to point them out. I mean, one example is the US Senate, the upper house, which is the dominant house in the US system, in which a multiracial California has the same clout as lily white Wyoming, even though California's population is 70 times larger. The Electoral College, which chooses the president, is also weighted in favor of white rural interests, and the Supreme Court essentially, reifies those racist relationships 1,000 times over in its decisions. So the result is a society which purports to be democratic, but which Blacks are poorer. They live in heavily segregated housing. They make up a disproportionate portion of an oversized prison population. They lack anything, they lack formal political equality, and these wrongs are ongoing, and in fact, for America, powerful Black backlash in favor of those old racist structures. So anyway, those are the conclusions. So thank you for the chance to try to explain what the story is here. Bye.
Thank you very much. Mike just posted in the chat, this is the best potted history of the USA I've ever heard. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Okay, Andrea will talk about the situation in particular in Britain. Welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to come on this evening. So first of all, I am going to start off with the 5th century and the Arab slavery. So this comes under the trans-Saharan slavery, and I've been currently researching this at the moment because obviously, slavery did not start with the Atlantic slavery. So yeah, I wanted to start off with the Arab slavery and then work my way up to obviously the British involvement and how it obviously still impacts things today. So what I found out was basically the Arab slavery started in the 5th century, and it was pretty much started with African prisoners. So they were sent all over the place, so like pretty much the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and they were taken through the Sahara Desert as well. So like imagine, you know, all that temperature through the desert and walking through that as well. That's like torture, to be honest. So having to go through all of that and then, you know, being spread across pretty much through the Mediterranean Sea. So yeah, this lasted until, you know, pretty much the 18th, 19th century, like, and it's obviously still pretty much going on now in Libya as well. But in terms of like the things that the slaves went through and like the time periods as well, like during the Middle Ages as well, like slaves were also taken as concubines as well. So African Arabian families and used as concubines. So obviously the man would have his wives, but then use the African women as sex slaves, you know. So there is estimated that 25 million Africans were taken during this time period as well. So like the loss for Africa as well in terms of human cost, and those you know, building up the country and building up the continent as a whole, like it's a huge loss, and it's something that's not widely spoken about as well. So you know, there was also castration as well. So the male's body parts were cut off, and it was pretty much an unfortunate situation in terms of how many men were taken compared to women as well. So nowadays there are pretty much more African women than there are men. So it's, you know, economically, it's had a huge impact in what's going on. So yeah, moving forward into like the future as well, like the slaves were literally just taken from the River Nile as well, and thrown into different Arabian countries with little to no disruption. And in terms of when it comes to like abolishing it as well, there was pretty much a bey from Tunis who decided that he wanted to outlaw it, and then it wasn't brought fully into law until 1846. So slavery, you know, the taking of Africans and putting them into Arabian places were basically, you know, there was nothing going on. And it's lasted centuries, even before the European countries even thought about getting involved in it as well. So like, you know, more need to be discussed about how, you know, the Arabian slave trade has basically led on to other slave trades, and basically how the Europeans and America were able to materialize off it and make it more brutal than what it was in the eyes of what's happened in slavery research as well. So there's just so much going on with it, like in terms of like who actually made profits out of it, because like, you know, it still does continue to happen, especially in Libya, where there's issues with Nigerians trying to get through there because it's one of the places that you can reach Europe. And like, you know, they're taken and they're beaten up, they're skinned. They also have body parts cut off as well, and they're tortured, parents called up for the money as well. And it's not just Africans, Ethiopians as well, and other countries as well in Eastern and Western Africa. So, you know, this is pretty much a passage for these people come to Europe and make new lives for themselves. And before they can even reach here, they have to think about ways of avoiding these slave merchants that are basically taking them. And it's all over the well, and it's not being called out by the government, and there's been no opposition from the Labour Party on it either. So like, it's you know, it's pretty much a really, really big issue out here, and we need to be focusing ways on highlighting the issue and spreading awareness about it, because so many people are suffering, and they're suffering because they're trying to make a new life for themselves. So I'm going to move on to like the British slave trade, and obviously how that was started, and they basically, you know, how it impacts on us today as well, because, you know, slavery isn't over. There's estimated to be 40 million slaves currently worldwide, and you know, there's organizations that support those in modern slavery as well. So, you know, starting from the 10th century, like, you know, they were no, before the 10th century even, sorry, apologies, during the Roman times, like slaves were here, and they just weren't, you know, they were European, they were English people, and they were here, you know, taken in by merchants and basically made to work. And then obviously, you know, during the transatlantic slave trade, they basically decided that Africans were more profitable, you know, and easier to go and get as well. So what they did was they, you know, they met up with the Arabs, saw what the Arabs had basically done, and decided, oh yeah, let's make this more profitable and go out to the Western countries, Western African countries, and, you know, get these slaves up and running. And they decided to do the Middle Passage. So that's how it first did. And they were basically collecting their stock. So that was rum, cotton, and then they were going to African countries collecting the slaves, and then they were going back and selling all of their profits and selling the slaves with those profits as well. So, you know, they were making so much money out of this. And this was started off with British merchants as well. Like that's important to state as well. Like it was British merchants that made it more, you know, out there and more widespread as well, especially in the Caribbean countries. Like in my mum's country in St. Lucia, like it was started up by Quakers. So like these people were basically handled and then beaten. Like, you know what I mean? So at the end of the day, they were trying to spread like the Christian message, and then were beating them, raping them, you know, taking their children off them, and leaving them in really, really nasty conditions. Like I've read somewhere that St. Lucian slaves were actually treated the worst in the Caribbean islands. I don't know if it's true, you can argue against it, but that's what I've seen out there on it. And you know, what's even like, for me anyway, in my situation and in my upbringing as well, like in where I am in Wandsworth, the Quakers actually started up here, and there's a Quaker hall here, and the person that opened it has the same surname as me. So it's really, really like disturbing how my grandparents, like during the Windrush period, were able to end up in Wandsworth initially, where the person who had started up slavery in St. Lucia and had his slaves and stuff was based here. So that's basically the impact that it's had on my family and stuff. And to like, I don't know how I feel about it as well. It's like really, really random that that's how it's, you know, how it's impacted my life and stuff. But yeah, in terms of how slaves are, in terms of how, like, you know, in other parts of the Caribbean as well, like the plantations, like people are getting married in these places. Like, and you know, it's actually a really, really big deal. Like you see reviews about how great it is to have your wedding there and stuff. But like so many people were raped and killed here, and you're using the best day of your life to go out there and get married. Like it's just really, really bizarre, and I don't understand it. But it is a moneymaker. And at the end of the day, this is how, you know, us continuing to fight slavery and continuing to fight off the profits being made of slavery as well is a really big deal and needs to continue. So in terms of like, you know, other impacts of slavery as well, like, you know, take my father's country in Guyana, where the Africans were taken there first. And then once they got tired of the Africans and the Africans were freed from slavery, well, they brought in my great-grandfather, who's Indian. And he was promised a new life. He was promised how to, that he was going to have, you know, he'll be paid for the work that he's doing. And be able to go home once he's finished his time out there. So they were contracted for like 5 to 7 years. And obviously my great-grandfather didn't come back. He stayed out there, and my grandfather and obviously the rest of us out there are farmers out there. So, you know, that's the impacts that it's had. But then in places like Guyana, there's hostility with Indians and Blacks due to, you know, the Blacks being given one part of Guyana, then the Indians being given a nicer part. So now everybody's hating on each other, but rather than coming at the British, who has caused all of this and has run away and has left ridiculous laws, like, you know, especially against LGBTQ, you know, against, you know, there's, you know, marriage, like the different religions, the hostilities. Like my upbringing is obviously different as well. I've had a Catholic upbringing and I've had a Hindu upbringing, plus a Seventh Adventist upbringing as well. And my grandparents actually be together either because of how hostile those times were. So, you know, like the only time I've ever actually been with my grandparents is at my father's funeral, unfortunately. So that's the only, you know, that's how much it impacts, you know, these things impact on people, even during these times, you know. But I guess when we look at the UK and how it's, you know, how slavery's influenced and impacted the UK, well, you just got to look at the banks. You just got to look at all of the money that they're making, the fact that they can get big fat bonuses and nothing's done about it. Nobody gets thrown out if they're useless at their jobs. You know, even the government as well, Parliament, even the Lords, like existing as well, the monarchy, even, you know, like currently now the Caribbean are now talking about getting rid of the monarchy. They don't want her. So we've had Barbados obviously say they don't want her anymore. Jamaica are in talks. St. Lucia are doing whatever they're doing. I don't even have a clue. And Guyana have got rid of the Queen 70 years ago. So that's basically where we're at here. Like, you know, in the 21st century, the Caribbean islands are now coming together as well and talking about reparations and wanting to fight back and repair the damage that's been caused through the economic side of slavery. So although I don't really support their demands because it's come from the government rather than grassroots organisations, I can't really downplay the fact that they're doing it. Do you know what I mean? But I just wish that grassroots organisations out there had more of a say, or actually just got out there and said, like, boom, we want this, and then we can get behind it. Because right now it's literally the governments, and to be honest, like, if any of you know anything about Caribbean politics, it's about lining their own pockets and feeding their own families and feeding their families, friends and this, that and the other. And it's out there, it's more out there. At the end of the day, the British are obviously better at hiding their well, we thought they were better than hiding their things, but obviously with the parties that are going on now, that's not happening anymore. But like, it's more out there with the corruption and that, and it's, you know, there's people in the Caribbean basically living in homes that were built in the slavery times. I've actually got family members living in homes that were built in the slavery times, because there's no, you know, there's no mass building of council homes out there. Do you know what I mean? That's not happening. It's units, and like the units are not, you know, up to standard and stuff like that. So people are suffering, like those sewage systems, like schools, the way the children are educated, they get a good education, but like the resources that they have, you know, there's just so much that you can go on about in terms of like the effects that slavery has had. Because, like, you know, at the end of the day, like, people just look at me as a Black woman, but then my great-great-grandmother is actually white, white British. So it's like, you know, and the boys in my family are lighter skinned than the girls. Do you know what I mean? So we're all dark skinned. So it's, you know, remarkable, like how, like, so much damage and brutality and stuff has like ended up with people like me, who are like completely mixed up and have so much heritage behind me, so many cultures behind me. And yeah, I feel lucky that I've had that. But obviously the cost and the impact that it's had on my ancestors and those before me, they've obviously been through so much for us to get to where we are now, and we still haven't achieved half of what we wanted to. And it's because we're not together, we're not building together, we're not coming together to fight on the same things. There's so many different groups that are fighting on different causes, but fighting for the same thing at the same time. So do you know what I mean? You know, we need to come together and actually fight slavery and to fight to end, you know, modern day slavery as well. Because as I said previously, there are 40 million people still going through it. Slavery hasn't ended, it's still here. And at the end of the day, you know, there are people that are being brought here illegally. There are people with mental health and alcohol disorders that are being taken liberties out of as well, made to do work and not being paid for. There are disabled people that are going through it as well. There are people that can't speak English as a second language that are going through it. So at the end of the day, you know, there are women that are coming over here as well that are thinking that they are going to have their best job ever, start a new life, only to end up in a brothel having to sell their body to feed themselves. So, you know, at the end of the day, we've got a lot of work to do, and we've got to still keep up the pressure on ending modern day slavery, because slavery hasn't gone. It's just in another form now, but we've got to keep updated with what form that is and ensure that there are the right support groups, and to ensure that we're keeping our parliamentarians, pushing them to keep pressure on the government to obviously end this, because the more it continues, the more people suffer. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to both speakers. Comrades, if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand under, there's 3 little dots on the bottom of your screen, or it kind of depends on your operating system. That's how it usually works. And when Andrea was speaking, I was reminded that, of course, you're also the kind of person, as is Jackie Walker, who is hugely affected by the new nationalities bill. So you've had this, you know, the historic injustice done to your parents, your grandparents, etc. And because of that, now you're also liable to be, you know, just deported if you participate in a demonstration that they don't like, etc. That is ruled unacceptable behavior, I think is the formulation in the bill. It is quite outrageous. We have quite a lot of people who've put their hands up. Going through a few people now. John, please.
Good evening, Tina. Good evening, Dan, and good evening, Andrea. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I particularly found the testimony that Andrea has shared with us very moving, and really, you know, the personal testimony of Andrea was, as I say, absolutely moving. A couple of points I'd like to make. The first being that the irony of the current situation that Andrea so well described was that the modern slavery that we hear of from Libya is largely caused by the destabilization of Libya following the bombing by the US and British forces there just a few years ago that destroyed the stability that had been in place under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, and that slavery should be one of the principal results of that adventurism or imperial US and Anglo imperialism is both ironic and typical of the causes of US and Anglo imperialism across the world. And so I'd just like to say thank you very much for the testimony this evening. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Andrea and Dan, if you ever want to come in between, you don't have to wait to the end, just wave to me. Ken, please.
Good evening, and thanks again to Dan and Andrea for 2 very interesting and thought-provoking talks. My question really goes to sort of both Dan and Andrea, and the question is, to what extent did slavery provide the basis for capitalism in the US and in Britain, and in what different ways did it affect the development of capitalism in those countries, and how far does its effects linger today? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Did you want to speak, Dan?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
In America, slavery, I would argue, was actually an impediment to capitalist development, because most of the wealth of the slaveocracy, well, its effects were mixed before the Civil War. Yes, the North made a lot of money off the cotton trade. Northerners were involved in the slave trade before it was abolished in 1708. And a lot of money from the cotton trade flowed to the North. But at the same time, the federal government was in the hands of pro-Southern forces that were hostile to the bourgeois political program. They blocked the development of a transcontinental railroad, for example. They blocked other infrastructure development. They blocked the formation of a university system, which the northern bourgeoisie very much wanted. They blocked westward expansion for farmers, which the bourgeoisie again was pushing for. So you could argue that up until the 1820s or 30s would be the turning point, and beyond that, slavery turned into a drag on U.S. capitalist development. And ironically, 1833 is when the British moved to abolish slavery. So I guess the bourgeoisie in both countries recognized that slavery had turned from an asset into a growing liability, and they wanted it out of the way. And the fact that the South clung to it was increasingly intolerable.
Okay, thank you. Jenny, please.
Hi, I just want to ask a couple of questions and also a couple of comments. I was really interested in what Dan was saying, but was reminded of a film that I saw a few years ago now called The 13th. And The 13th is all about the 13th Amendment in the American Constitution. And I'll just quote the exactly what it said. It said, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place subject to their jurisdiction." So it was a kind of acceptance that there's no such thing as slavery, but with quite a huge caveat to that, which was, but you can do it in prison. And the way it's done is when you privatize the prison service and then make the prisoners work for no money. What more can you have as a kind of slavery than that? And in particular, where the numbers of convicted people in prisons, that the Black community is disproportionately represented in those prisons. And I just thought that was, it's on Netflix, this film, and it's really well worth the watch. And it's about how modern slavery can be built on on the bones of slavery in the past, really. A really classic example. Another that was given was that the sentences doled out for crack were much higher than those for the use of cocaine. And of course, we all know who uses which, don't we? That sort of thing. And it's just really interesting how that sort of morphed. And then, so if as could happen in the UK, that the prison service is privatized, we could end up with a similar situation in the UK as well, with similar statistics concerning the ethnicity of people in prisons. So that's the first point I want to make. And then the second one was also, this was something that I found really, really difficult. Whilst living in, I lived in Handsworth for a number of years, and I had a very close relationship both with the African community and the African Caribbean community. And when the African community in Handsworth or thereabouts began to increase, there developed a tension between the African Caribbean community and the African community. And what it was based on, some members of the African Caribbean community blaming Africans for being involved in the slave trade in Africa. And as a white woman, it was really difficult for me to hear this or even to challenge it as a white woman, although I did try, because of course the concepts of slavery from a Western culture were different from the practices of what some people call slavery in West Africa. It was quite a different concept for a start off, and it was and the Western concept of it was imported into West Africa and built on. But it was really difficult to have to listen to those conversations, really. And then finally, of course, we mustn't forget the number of British and multinational companies, how they use cheap labor in places like Pakistan, India, and elsewhere. For instance, Primark, you know, having factories in Pakistan and India, where people work in terrible conditions on what can only be described as slave wages. So I'd just be interested in the opinions of Dan and Andrea over those points. I'm sorry I went on for too long.
No problem at all. Conchita, please.
Hello. I really enjoyed what Andrea said, and I wanted to add something to that. I was interested on other ways, other means of trade being monopolized around the Mediterranean and then around the coast of Africa, and then the achievement of being able to cross the Atlantic. So I studied or read how they built ships and the technology that enabled the corporations or the rich elite to be able to buy and build ships strong enough to withstand the currents of West Africa and travel across the Atlantic in order to even deliver logs themselves. And so I was interested in actual wood and the usefulness of wood to create the tools that started all these transatlantic trades, and railway systems as well. So I just wanted to mention that because, for example, the caravelas and some of the Spanish galleons, when they were made, they were too big and clunky to be able to cross the Atlantic. They had to develop sails, and they had to develop a type of wooden ship that was heavy and light, and all the wood that needed to be chopped up and cut up in order to make all these boats, and also the map drawing technologies, actually having maps that were accurate enough to allow these sailors to cross Atlantic in strong currents using these boats. And that was, in a sense, quite interesting. And it also took me to the traders of the corporations, the transatlantic corporations. There was one in Holland, one in Britain, there was one in Russia. So that's all. That's what I wanted to add. And that historical perspective to me was fascinating in also thinking about how you start commerce and trade and the profit of it, never mind the human toll that it has, but also the ecological toll on the Mediterranean coastline with chopping trees in order to create this industry and export it, have a wealth through exporting, which is paper-based. Well, anyway, it grew in how Europe and the Mediterranean and Britain as well really created this wealth, what motivated them, and the wood that they needed to have in order to support it. Sorry.
Thank you, comrade. I am actually going to abuse my position. I'll also ask a question, which is when Ken came in and asked about the role that slavery played in setting up capitalism. I think this is also quite interesting. I was a bit surprised by Dan's reply. So perhaps we could discuss this a bit more. So as I understand it now, how reading Marx and others, slavery was quite crucial to the success in moving from the system of a feudal system to capitalism, which is based on expanding and becoming more profitable, etc. And that slavery and slave trade played a huge role in allowing for that. And I'm quite surprised that you think it's not quite that straightforward, but perhaps you could expand on this a little bit. Also, then at some stage, capitalism, if they could, they would exploit us all 24 hours a day with no wages, for free, etc. Did it at some stage come to a point where there's political reasons and a fight back, etc. But also that slavery slave trade was just not profitable anymore either, which I think played a big role in the UK. And then also I'd like to know where comrades think the role of people from below. I know there's been boycotts in the past of people boycotting slave trade ships, etc. Normal, I'm not sure you can call them working class yet, but people from below opposing those kind of slave trade. I think Andrea, you had your hand up. Did you want to reply?
So I guess from like the Caribbean's point of view and stuff like that, there was a lot of uprisings. So slavery, so on like plantations like where my family was, there was like 5 or 6 slavers, but then there was a lot more enslaved people. So there was literally like a lot of uprisings. So there was like 250. So it was getting to the point where they were, slaves were basically either freeing themselves or killing the slavers. So, that's, one of the main reasons why they stopped, why they've, had to end it really, because they weren't, they couldn't continue doing this, especially if they didn't have enough people to put on their plantations to watch the slaves. I guess also like, how much, how it impacted capitalism. Well, you've got to look at the structures, haven't you, of places like Black people are still more likely to be less paid than white people. In London, it's 23% we're paid less. Do you know what I mean? It's organizations in terms of promotions, Black people aren't able to get promoted, especially in jobs where they're overrepresented. places like the NHS, you know, front-facing jobs. They're not going to be in higher roles. You know, even down to your university lecturers. Like, I think even I've been higher paid than one that I had seen exposed. So she was like on 30 grand or something. Now this is a university lecturer. So what incentive is people going to have to, you know, go and do that role if they're not going to get paid accordingly? Do you know what I mean? You know, the way that we're treated, you've got to look at, you know, PPE and stuff like that over here as well. BAME assessments as well. It's not BAME assessments, black assessments as well. So, you know, like, it still impacts us, how we're treated, how we progress in life. It doesn't matter if you're born here as well, you know, like me as a black person with an English name, like, you know, I will get loads and loads of job interviews, and I can tell when somebody's read my CV by the look on their face when they see me, like the shock and horror that it's a black woman that's turned up to the interview rather than a white woman. Do you know what I mean? So that's other issues that have come from it. You know, those are the things that impact us now. You know, the organizations that started slavery up are still making money. You've got people complaining about statues being taken down, councils refusing to listen to residents that have been put in petition after petition. Do you know what I mean? To get rid of these things that still affect them, and still discuss what's happened during slavery, you know, like, but you get people that are upset about these things. It still has an impact, you know, on how we go about making money and looking after our families. Our children are more likely to be excluded. Our children are more likely to be stopped and searched. Our children are more likely to, you know, not get into a Russell University. But that's obviously improving now, but it's because we've had to make a song and dance about it. Do you know what I mean? So, like, yeah, those are the things that I would say, how it's built up capitalism. People are still making more money, and, you know, working classes, and, you know, there were white slaves at one stage as well. So, you know, they keep the working class down, don't they? And black people are more likely to be working class, even the ones that make it up in the world and forget themselves.
Andrea, Dan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, please. First of all, I wanted to comment on what several people have said. Jenny is completely correct about the prison system in the U.S. as a kind of neo-slavery, and yes, Black people, racial minorities in general, are a grossly disproportionate part of that population. And yes, then the history of privatization, and these people have been rented out as slaves over, you know, the course of the 19th and 20th century. So, and it's still going on, by the way. So it's really quite shocking. So she's right to bring that up. And I was very interested in the question of Africans versus Afro-Caribbeans. But to me, it's like, you know, it's just so silly to break the problem down to those kinds of ethnic ways or racial ways, because obviously an African today is no more responsible for the slave trade 2 or 3 centuries ago than, I don't know, than a white person in New York is responsible for slavery prior to 1861. Conchita, and I agree with you what Conchita had to say, and it's quite ironic. I mean, history is filled with these ironies. I mean, when the Portuguese began inching their way down the West African coast under Henry the Navigator in the I think starting in 1319, it was a really quite heroic effort. I mean, it took them years, decades to master the very tricky, you know, winds and currents, and to develop the right kind of naval technology. And it was really an amazing feat. They were hoping to find gold, but when they finally rounded, you know, went into the bight of Africa, it's called, what they found were slaves. And Portugal began importing slavery as early as the mid 14th century. So, and slavery quickly turned into a very profitable trade. And Tina, yes, of course, you're right. I mean, slavery was very important in the development of capitalism. And by the 17th century, Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, was the most profitable of all the French colonies, and the sugar trade was vitally important industry in the by the 17th century, and slavery was was central to that. And what's also interesting is that the sugar production was industrialized and very heavily mechanized. So the slave population of what's now Haiti were in many ways some of the first true modern industrial workers. And they were a key part of this kind of early pre-industrial development. But my point is simply that it's sort of remarkable how the bourgeoisie would take on these tools and then cast them off as soon as they became unprofitable. So Andrea is correct. I mean, slave rebellions were a growing cost. The Haitian Rebellion was a monumental event. I would point out that there have been three great slave rebellions in history. The Spartacus Rebellion of 71 BC. There was a very powerful slave rebellion in Iraq in the early 9th century, which totally paralyzed Iraq for 10 years. And then there was Haiti. But there were also major slave rebellions in Jamaica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, all through the Caribbean. And those were part of the growing costs that eventually convinced the bourgeoisie that that wage slavery was preferable. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, another round of comments from the floor. Victor, please. Can you unmute yourself?
Good evening, Tina. Good evening, comrades. Pleasure to be speaking to you. Slavery probably goes back to time immemorial. Even 800 years ago, I would guess that almost the entire world practiced slavery. Then we had just been conquered by the Normans. All the indigenous Britain's properties were seized by the Normans and reallocated as per their book, the Domesday Book. And almost all indigenous people became what it was called serfs. Serfdom being a thinly disguised form of slavery. Prior to that, of course, we were conquered by the Romans. One of the great spurs for Roman Empire and Roman conquest was to capture more and more people to be used as slaves. And indeed, almost everybody in Rome, including all the Caesars, all the senators, all owned slaves. The Roman economy almost depended on slaves. And indeed, when the white man went to Africa, he found that slavery was still there, alive and well. And some white men participated in slavery. And that is how the David Cameron family became very rich. And that is how Cameron managed to get the silver spoon in his mouth, because his ancestors made a big fortune out of slavery. Which brings me on to another point. I hope that if the descendants of the slaves are going to be compensated, it's not going to be by everybody, most of whom were not participating in and benefiting from slavery. I hope that people like Dave Cameron, who are the beneficiaries of slavery, will be the ones to pay reparations. More recently, in the UK, after serfdom died away, we turned our back on slavery. 250 years ago, we were almost a schizophrenic nation. Slavery was not allowed in England, but lots of people, English people, like Cameron's ancestors, went to Africa and were able to continue practicing it there. Very schizophrenic. There was one slave owner who made the mistake of bringing his slave back to England, only to find the court told him that his slave was now a free man because there's no such thing as slavery in England. And that was about 250, 300 years ago. I regret to say that a form of slavery is gradually creeping back, sanctioned by mental health authorities in particular, local Blairite governments, and indeed our national governments since the Brown-Blair era. Inside mental health services, we are now being told that mental health drop-ins must be scrapped. People who are mentally ill don't need treatment or therapy. What they need is to go to work. So it's a play on what the Nazis said. Work brings you freedom. And according to our mental health services, work cures mental illness. As a result of that attitude, we have business conglomerates like First Step Trust forming. They operate all over London. They operate all sorts of businesses, from smart car garages to Aberville's restaurants. Almost everybody who
Start
works
winding
there
up now, please, comrade.
unpaid.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'll stop. I don't want to bore you. Thank you.
No, well, I thought you could finish your sentence, but okay. Steve, please. O'Neill, sorry, Steve O'Neill first.
Hi. Yeah, this question for Dan. First question is, have you heard of Dr. Gerald Horne, Black professor? And if you have, his argument about the American Revolution was that it was sparked off, well, by many things, but one of them is the Somerset Case, where an American brings a slave to England, a slave's named Somerset. Somerset, well, I'm on free soil, therefore I'm free. It went to court, and the court found in favor of Somerset, which, caused a few midnight oil to be burned in America. Now, sometime later, we had the Dred Scott case, which the finding was just the opposite. I think it was Justice Taney who said that a slave is like a piece of furniture. Basically, what happened was that the slave owner brought his slave onto free soil, and his name was Dred Scott. And Dred Scott said, "Well, in that case, I'm free." And went to Supreme Court, and Justice Taney said, "No, you're not, because you're like a piece of furniture. You're chattel, and chattel means stuff that we own." But do you think that the Somerset case had much of a bearing on the American Revolution? And that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. John, and then the other Steve.
Hello.
Hi.
So I think what I'm looking for is some kind of clarification that I understand what's at the heart of what's being discussed here. Abolish slavery. The answer, yes. The question, how? But I'm really trying to get to grips with what we're talking about, because I think that there's an element of confusion, but maybe it's me who's confused. And I think we need great clarity. And sometimes it's about language. A previous speaker referred to the Portuguese and the Portuguese Empire and so on. Yeah, Some of the confusion there was to do with language. If you look up exploração in Portuguese, you'll see it has two meanings. Exploração means exploration, and it means exploitation. So imagine if that was your language, and those two words, or that one word, conveyed those two different meanings. So we really do need to understand what we're talking about. And hence my concern is that I don't know, I'm wrestling with this. I don't say I have the answer, but I'm wrestling with what is being discussed here in terms of slavery. And I've got a feeling, I hope I'm not, I hope I'm not right. I feel as if the left is missing a trick here, because essentially we've got a situation where slavery, we know what slavery is and we know what slavery was, okay? But we have this idea about modern slavery as like a panacea at the moment. I'm of course aware of people living impoverished lives, powerless lives, where there is, you know, they're surrounded by injustice, there's brutality, oppression, of course. And I see how those things kind of exist today, but I don't see the left jumping on a cause. I see a moral gesture, but I don't see political ideas. As I say, the meeting tonight is called Abolish Slavery. How? Where's the political ideas? If we are also saying that basically harsh labor conditions is slavery, I don't know about that, because I don't know how we win people round to that point of view, because basically it isn't. Okay, so you have anarchists like Bakunin who will say that slavery may change its name, but the essence of slavery remains the same. Great, but where does that get us? And clearly Bakunin, as an anarchist, is not thinking about the kind of revolutionary side, the revolutionary aspect. We had reference to Haiti just now and Toussaint Louverture. Yeah, he was a revolutionary, right? So there were ideas. We had a speaker who talked about having family or whatever, living in homes that date back to slavery times with poor sewage systems and so on. And these are indeed the effects of slavery. It's horrendous. But where's the political mobilization? Where are people organized to combine through trade unions, through democratic institutions? Where is the left kind of harnessing and bringing people together, developing a fellowship in life, whereby we can move forward and deal with the injustices? And so I'm kind of left thinking that there aren't specifics here, which I think if we had the specifics, we could maybe do something about. And I'm also left with this idea that maybe if it's all too vague, that it's kind of just like, it's like when people will say, oh, well, it's the Holocaust or it's fascism or whatever. You know, again, I come back to language. These words can be bandied about, but what do they really mean? And if we really want to make a change, and if we want things to improve, quote, abolish slavery, then I think it has to be something that's much more detailed and fleshed out, and something that's much more kind of constructive. And so when I you know, imagine the atrocities of slavery, and then I see people saying, well, it's actually just now today, it's about cheap labor. It's about, you know, anything that's unpleasant, anything that's oppressive. Well, fine, but then you know, that's maybe a worthy goal, but there needs to be the means. That, you know, there's the means to get to the goal. So I think what I'm looking for from the left is something that's much more kind of coherent, something that's much more detailed, something that offers liberation, something that offers a sense of hope, as opposed to this kind of catch-all word, which is slavery, which as I say, we know what it means, but what are we talking about here in this kind of modern sense? So I'm not just talking about being pedantic about language. Forgive me if that's what is coming across here, but I do think that language is part of the solution. I do think we need to kind of pin these things down and deal with them, because otherwise we talk about slavery kind of embracing every kind of wrong. The good thing about that is, of course, well, okay, let's just have the revolution tomorrow. right? But that's my point. That isn't going to happen. So how is the left mobilizing, educating, bringing people together, thinking about, you know, their democratic rights, their human rights? Where is the mobilization so that people who feel that they are on the receiving end of injustice, they maybe lack work opportunities, they lack whatever, they're being oppressed, how are they being supported, and how are they being encouraged to show their own self-determination and to kind of empower themselves?
Can you wind up now, please? Thank you.
That's basically it. How?
Okay.
And I'm not hearing anything, so I look forward to a response.
You're in the middle of one of those meetings where we're trying to do exactly that.
Great. So looking forward to the next few minutes.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Steve, please.
Yeah, to the last comrade, the obvious answer is you should come and get in contact with the Republican Labour working group and see if that's got any ideas that would reach. I can't miss that opportunity. Anyway, I thought I might start with, first of all, to thank Dan and Andrea for their contributions. I wanted to go slightly more American, but not because I'm in America, but I think we can see stuff about ourselves by looking at America. Even if we take Black Lives Matter movement in America, let's just see what that tells us about America, because I think Dan was onto something here. So I think the US Constitution, which we were talking about, was forged 1775 to 1783, Dan was telling us, but it seems to me it's in opposition to the British Constitution. So if we want to understand something about the British Constitution from 1688 to 1707, having a look at America might be a way of thinking about ourselves as opposed to just thinking about America, which would be a thing in itself. So, and what you see, and I've heard Dan speak before about this, in the left in England, but not so much in Scotland, Wales or Ireland, the lefty here is not that interested in constitutions. You know, I mean, think it, well, it's something about like words written on paper, you know, which is a bit airy-fairy, but people maybe believe the Constitution's irrelevant. But of course, the Constitution embodies social relations. It's not just paper. It embodies in the Constitution the relationship between labor and capital, or the relationship between slave owners and slaves. And Marx really understood this idea, it seems to me, very well. And what it does is it bakes those relationships into, as it were, the law of the land. So when we study the Constitution of America or anything else, we are talking about the social life, social relations of American society. And when we talk about the Constitution in Britain, that's what we're thinking about here, about the relationships between classes. Now, I think the idea would be that the abolition of slavery in America, when it came, didn't end racism. Or in a way, it built racism into the political system, because although the constitutional laws were changed as a result of the American Civil War, it didn't overthrow the Constitution. There wasn't really a democratic revolution from below that took power through the Civil War. In a sense, it was a kind of conservative revolution, if you could call it that. It left everything in place, and you've explained why that was so. Now, when Marx, of course, for example, when Marx was talking about federalism, which is so central to the American Constitution, he spoke about federalism as being, in one sense, a step forward, because it allowed all these different separate states in America to unite together in a federal constitution. But then he said it would be a barrier, because it would allow each separate state to have rights which could be held against the rights of the majority. And we see how that works out in practice. So federalism is something which holds the working class back, as does the Senate, as does the Electoral College, as does the Supreme Court, and those things that Dan said. So it seems to me, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, we could then talk about the British Constitution, all the stuff that we've got. Yeah, I don't know whether Boris Johnson thinks we've got a better constitution than America, because we've got a monarchy, we've got House of Lords, we've got, I don't know else what we've got. It's British for a start off, and the Americans haven't got that anyway. So, but in America, it seems to me that what the Black Lives Matter movement says to me is that there's a social movement and a movement through the politics of America that really wants a new constitution. That American politics will be frozen or stuck where it is until the idea of a new republic comes to America, a democratic republic, not one that's still rooted in the Constitution of 1775 to 1783, I think the dates were. So I think that politics in America has to become much more Republican, much more about constitutions, and that the idea that these social movements, very important social movements, are going to get very far at all unless they become more political and say we need to completely transform democracy in America. Now, I said it's about Britain, so I guess that's the same lesson here. We're not going to solve the problems of racism and other things in our society and the social relationships and the domination of the working class unless we realize that we too have got to start doing something about changing our constitution. It's coming anyway because our constitution is bust. Whether it's because Ireland's going or Scotland or Wales going, we're going to be forced into a situation where we have to re-look at this in a much more serious way. So I'm not more really directing that, I guess, to Dan and for Dan's comments on that sort of thesis, if you like.
We have now two comrades who want to come in who don't have a camera. So I'm going to put us on the screen and we can hear now. George, please.
Yes, I'd just like to touch on India. The Indian situation is not very well touched on. I'm citing the good example of the Untouchables, where there is a form of slavery which is unique to the Hindu culture. And of course, the glue that really holds it all together is the caste system. And it's a very sophisticated form in the way that it operates and how Indian society is riven by four main castes. And that's one good example. The other point I want to cite is an example in Wembley. I lived in Wembley and watched two temples being built. They were Hindu temples. But even there, those two projects, the caste system and the caste system and slavery operated. In Wembley, in Alperton, there was a scandal cropped up where we found out that the stonemasons who performed this beautiful work were quartered in barrack-like quarters, and they were living in the most terrible conditions. The situation blew out as a result of a councillor's effort in the parliament. And the situation then caught the attention of the local trade union movement, and we campaigned to try and achieve better conditions for those labourers. That's all I want to touch on. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Okay, Crystal, please. Can you unmute yourself?
Hiya, thank you. I feel really rude because I can't remember the lady's name. I think she spoke at the beginning. I think it might have been Jenny. I'm not sure.
Jenny, yes, I think, yeah.
But really, I wanted to ask a question because I definitely feel like everyone's obviously got like such great, insights or comments and stuff. But I do feel like it's important as well that I don't know, because I don't really know much about this, and that's why I'm here. I'm here to be kind of educated. So I feel like, I don't know, I want to ask a question rather than just I feel like sometimes I'm not saying, how do I say this without being, I feel like people maybe like me, who maybe haven't had a heritage where we've experienced quite so much of the suppression and slavery that other kind of cultures and people have, sometimes tend to talk more than ask and listen. And I feel like it's like, I don't know, I would just like to hear, it might not have been Jenny, I really can't remember her name, but I'd really like to hear, because she has such a connection and deep insight because of her relatives and stuff that have...
You mean Andrea, our main...
Andrea, yeah.
Sorry, of course.
Yeah, and I feel like it's really important that I'd like to give more of a platform and ask her more questions, because she maybe knows. And I don't know, I'm really rambling and I'm not making any sense, and I probably sound really like stuck up in what I'm saying in itself, which is really kind of hypocritical in what I'm saying. So I don't know, I just wanted to hear from her, like how she felt, like if she had any ideas about kind of ways in which we can kind of get this into the political movement, because I do hear what people are saying and stuff, but also there's people like me that have no idea about the history really, so we've got to kind of start from scratch. So although, yeah, like I get people saying we need ideas and where are the kind of actions that we're going to take, but like for some of us, we're here to learn first. Anyway, I'll shut up now, but yeah.
No, I agree. I think you're right. This is what this session is about. It's trying to learn what's going on. Thanks, Crystal. I'm totally with you. We have lost Dan. I think he's trying to reconnect at the moment, and I hope he will. We've got no more comments though, or no more hands up, but it's time to come to an end anyway. So I'd like to ask Andrea and Dan to sum up, reply to a few questions, etc.
Yeah,
perhaps it's worthwhile. Just one second. Yeah, just I thought it might be worthwhile to deal with something that one comrade asked, is the difference between slavery and wage slavery, because there no doubt there is a difference. Just, you know, being poor is different than having, you know, no control over your body and being sold like a you know, like a piece of meat. That certainly is a different level of exploitation. We want to abolish both. Obviously, as socialists, we do want to abolish slave labor as well as, you know, modern slavery. And then there is still slavery going on. When you have your passport taken away and you can't leave, etc., you are in effect being held as a slave. If comrades want to touch on that in their summing up, might be useful. If not, don't. Okay, Andrea, sorry I interrupted you, so you come in first.
No, it's all right. No, I was just going to jump back in. So yeah, I feel like so in terms of what Jenny was saying with like the African and the African Caribbean, like I did experience all of that. So I did see a lot of that going on in terms of like African Caribbeans being hostile to Africans about slavery, saying that they were the ones that that basically done it and were involved in it and would sell people on for money. So that's how I was basically raised on it. And I feel like it's due to lack of education as well. So what I've basically found out is in 2020, there was going to be like the first African and Caribbean summit. So both continents were getting together and, you know, going to discuss issues like climate change and, you know, trading and things like that. But that was postponed due to the that was postponed due to COVID. So it happened last year. I attended it, and it was just basically like them talking about like, this is the first time we're ever doing it. Like, it's like 300 years too late. But like we got there in the end, that they've joined together. And yeah, they were basically talking about trade, climate, and like ways that they can work with each other in the future. So there should be another one coming up, so I can share links with that if people want to obviously attend. But like in terms of you know, the education and that, well, in the Caribbean they're not educated about what happens in Africa, and in Africa they're obviously not educated about what goes on in Africa. So, you know, they're not educating each other on what's going on. So nobody knows what's going on, and people are being told, well, yeah, Africans were involved in slavery. So that's basically what the gist of how I've seen it. I obviously didn't follow that, and my child is African as well as Caribbean. So her father's from the Ivory Coast. So you know, in terms of what I feel like we can do to mobilize and stuff like that, me personally, I don't really see much going on. And I've worked with aid agencies before I was like involved with the Labour Party. And, you know, so I was fighting for aid to be given to countries, so the 0.7%. And, you know, nothing to ever really, you know, it's not really spread out. There's not much awareness of slavery. Nobody's really talking about it. I know there's one organisation that's big on supporting modern slavery, but they don't really do that much in terms of like advocacy or lobbying like MPs and stuff. So there's never ever campaigns from that organisation, which is Hestia. So yeah, there's not much out there in terms of like mobilizing people. You do get like campaign groups that are campaigning on obviously like certain laws and changing it, and you know, making work hours more you know, more better and stuff. But obviously like nobody's like actually said out there like, you know, this is slavery, let's abolish it, like let's all come together and mobilize. So you're not seeing much of that. Like moving forward, like I just feel like if all those groups do get together and, you know, do an action day or something like that, or just do something to get people out, I feel like more awareness needs to be discussed about it. So obviously the numbers of people that are currently enslaved needs to be out there as well. Obviously it's not out in the media unless somebody gets caught mistreating someone, then you don't really hear much about it, do you? You know, and that's the thing. If you're not seeing it out there, then people are not really going to mobilize against it. So that's just my personal opinion on it. Like more awareness needs to just literally be spread about it, and then maybe campaign groups can get together and do something on it. You know, maybe that's what our call out could be, you know, all of us get together and come up with the demands. I am pretty much where John is at, to be honest. That's how I'm thinking about it. Everybody like talks about it and says it's bad and it's a naughty thing to have been done, but yeah, nobody's actually like saying let's mobilize and get the unions and other organizations involved. Like there's nobody that's actually doing it, so it's just very vague. It's just very, you know, disorientated, where it's not like come together as one with like a set of demands or a set of something just to go out there and do something. So that's just pretty much where I'm at with it all. But I would obviously like to see something done on it, and I guess like, yeah, I'm doing a call out for all of those groups to come out and give us some demand so we can get out there and cause some chaos at Parliament or something. I don't know. That's my take on it anyway.
Thanks, Andrea. Okay, Dan, please.
So anyway, so first of all, I mean, I wanted to second what Steve Friedman said. I mean, the political forms that pertain throughout the world, but especially in America, are just so backwards, so undemocratic. They've got to be swept away and replaced with a radical socialist democracy, in which political equality is strict, absolutely strict and unvarying across the board. So yeah, I think we definitely need a clean sweep. That is the first task of socialism, and these constitutional questions have been just really neglected scandalously in recent decades, and they should really be moved to the front. On Steve O'Neill's question, I think that Somerset did not have much of an impact in America. Somerset was the ruling in, I think, 1773, which said that a black slave brought to English soil was instantly free because English common law made no allowance for slavery. That did not have much of an effect in America. It didn't have much of an effect elsewhere in the British North America or the Caribbean, because slavery lasted in those areas for another 60 years, and it expanded. And the British imperialists had no desire, no intention of doing away with slavery, except in England itself, where it was the most. It was negligible. And I agree with John Clemo that harsh labor conditions do not equal slavery necessarily, but what we are faced with is the legacy of slavery in the form of racism. I apologize. And racism is a huge problem. It's not an easy problem. It's got to be addressed, and that is the first task of any kind of workers' movement. And finally, about Tina's question, Marx did write extensively about slavery and why capitalism was eventually forced to do away with it. And what he said is that slaves were outside the circuits of capital, and capital needed to have the circuits completed. It needed consumers, and it needed a growing array of actors, of capitalist actors, individuals who would innovate and labor in every more advanced ways. And capitalism, wage slavery was just much more advanced, much more sophisticated, a much more utilitarian form of production than outright slavery was. In 1856, Marx visited. There was an industrial exhibit in London, in which one of the great attractions was something called the Mccormick Reaper, which is a device invented in Illinois, United States, which was for a mechanized reaping of wheat. And Marx made the point that this could only be developed in the northern free labor system, where a farmer would insist on a high degree of skill and attentiveness by his hired hands, and his hired hands would give that. But slavery couldn't, because slavery rendered labor ignoble, and the only way the slave could rebel and resist was by resisting to work, and being lazy, and making sure that he wouldn't develop skills to advance to handle advanced machinery. So Marx emphasized that it was only a free labor system could allow the mechanical development, intellectual development, etc., of capitalism. And I'm always struck, how rapidly capitalism, abandoned slavery once it stopped, padding the bottom line. Forms. And socialist labor will be all the more advanced when people work freely and creatively and democratically to develop the productive process. So socialist labor should be equally as much a quantum leap over wage slavery as wage slavery was over outright slavery. Anyway.
Good stuff. Thank you very much, comrades. I thought that was an interesting meeting tonight. Next week, we are looking, I believe, into the police, if I remember rightly. Sorry, comrades, I was just looking up something else. We have another meeting scheduled in on Monday, which Dan has actually agreed to speak as well. We're using you. Left, right, and center, which is on the issue of the truckers in Canada, and that's quite interesting, isn't it? What's going on there? And we want to look at the class character of what's going on there. Should we support them? What's happening? What are they fighting for, etc.? And is it a working class movement, or how's the working class looking at it? I'm just putting it in the chat here. and it would be great to see people at that meeting on Monday. So thank you both, Andrea and Dan, and thank you for attending. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.